In the last lecture, I told you about a movement that was going on in this country in the 1990s that was really taxing our court system. It was upsetting people in the country. Um, there was a lot of furor about this. The repressed memory movement had moved to Israel. We were starting to see cases in Canada, and it was really a big problem. And so, what I'd like to do today is talk to you about the research looking at the repressed memories. One of the reasons I love psychology and law so much is because you can often see the fruits of your research labor. So, the research that's done in this area can actually impact the way we do things in our criminal justice system. So, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the heroes of this story, and my heroes are the researchers. And so let's take a look at what they were doing. And let's talk about one researcher in particular. Her name is Elizabeth Loftus. Um, she was a cognitive psychologist, and she did some seminal work in the 1970s on suggestibility. Okay, she moved from cognitive psychology and is really considered probably one of the most amazing researchers in eyewitness memory um, and legal issues. But let's take a look at her original work and how it might apply to this repressed memory movement. So in 1974, she did an interesting little study. She had participants watch a very short movie of a car accident, a car crash. And so we're going to take a look at this car crash, and you'll have to look quickly because it happens very fast. Here's the Loftus car crash. I'm going to stop this and go back. Let's go back and look at that again. I told you it was quick. Okay, watch this. There's that short car crash. What they did after that is participants were divided into 5 groups. They were asked several questions about that quick little clip, this little accident. And the critical question had to do with the speed of the collision. So the question said, how fast were the vehicles going when they, and then group 1 had smashed into each other, collided, bumped into each other, hit each other when they contacted. You see, by using these slightly different terms, could we get people to report different speeds of the vehicle? So the answer to the question should be some speed, 25 miles an hour, 35 miles an hour. And what they found, of course, was participants were influenced by the word that was used in the question. And people who were in the smashed condition estimated that the cars were going much faster than people in the contacted condition. Now, Loftus did a bunch of other little studies looking at this particular video. She would suggest that there was a stop sign instead of a yield sign. I don't know if you remember, but in the actual video, there was a yield sign, not a stop sign. And so she did some studies where she questioned people saying, did the car stop at the stop sign? And sure enough, people bid onto that suggestive questioning and later on reported seeing a stop sign. So that was in 1974. Now fast forward to the 90s, and she was starting to see this repressed memory, recovered memory movement as possibly being a lot like some of the suggestibility research that she had done earlier. So this particular study was one of the first that she did, which was called Lost in the Shopping Mall. And what this particular study does is it kind of looks at the idea of journaling. And remember, journaling is one of the methods that was used in the therapy to recover memories. So what they did was they asked participants to remember childhood events. And they had, the participants were college students, and they got permission to talk to parents and about events that hadn't happened in that child's life. So a parent would say, well, yes, when she was 8 years old, she fell out of a tree and broke her arm, or whatever. So they were able to verify some events. Then, when the actual experiment came around, they were given 2 true events and 1 false event. So, um, did you ever climb a tree when you were 8 years old and fall out and break your arm? Yes, it happened to me. Once regardless of whether I said it happened or didn't happen, they were asked to write about what they remembered about the event. So what if I say, well, no, that didn't happen to me? Well, write about what might have happened. Just write a story about what happened, what could have happened during that event. And then they held 2 follow-up interviews where they basically recount the stories from the journal, what you wrote. So one of the false events was, do you remember when you were little and you got lost in a shopping mall? Okay, so that's why it's called the Lost in the Shopping Mall study. So what did they find? The Lost in the Mall results. Well, here we go. So let me take you through this. The blue is true events remembered. So you were 8 years old, you fell out of the tree. Okay. Now, in the first interview, the percent of the subjects had said, yes, I remember this. Now, if you see in interview 1, the false event, do you remember when you were little you got lost in a shopping mall? No one, not one single person remembered. Now remember, in between interview 1 and interview 2, there's that journaling that took place. So writing about it. Now what you see is in interview 2, almost 20% of the participants are starting to have a memory of being lost in the shopping mall. And by the third interview, about 25% of the participants actually remembered being lost in the shopping mall. So what you're having here is a quarter of the participants are now remembering an event that didn't ever happen to them. And that was based on just simply writing about a false event. So let's keep going and looking at some of this other work that she did. Remember, one of the other techniques that the therapists use in the recovered memory movement was guided imagery, where you just simply imagine that something's happened, let your thoughts wander where they may. So what she did in this particular study, she asked individuals to indicate the likelihood that certain events happened to them in childhood. Okay, so what was the likelihood? So the list of things that were there were 40 different events, and they were supposed to rate whether or not they did or did not happen, definitely happened, whatever. So here's one example. Imagine playing inside at home after school. You hear a strange sound outside. So you run towards the window and you tripped and fell and reached out your hand. When you reached out your hand, you broke the window with your hand. So did that or did not happen? So let's say I say, no, that didn't happen. Well, then we asked some guided imagery questions. Don't worry about whether it did or did not happen. Just think about this particular situation. What might you have tripped on as you were running to the window? How did you feel? Questions like that. So in other words, a guided imagery task. What did they find? 2 weeks later, okay, imagine some of the events, okay, just like I said. So what were the results? Here you go. So the blue are participants who were not asked to do the imagination. So they simply asked the question, did this or did this not happen, but there was no imagination. And the orange are the participants who imagined the event. So what you see here, what you see here is the results of their study. First of all, I think I want to point out to you that many people started to report these events had occurred after their first interview. So first time it may not have felt real to you, but it seemed, yeah, finding $10, yeah, that could have happened. It seems more real. Same with a bad haircut. But look here, the people who actually did the imagination were much more likely and much more confident that that event had actually occurred when they get interviewed a few weeks later. So, won a pet, had a bad haircut. Here's the window situation. that you tripped and fell and broke a window. So again, what Loftus was showing was that through guided imagery, you can make people feel as if some things that hadn't occurred to them actually had occurred. Here's another study by Beth Loftus, and again, many of her studies are extremely clever. So what they did in this study is the first week they were given 20 childhood events, and they were asked to indicate whether they had ever done one of these things. There was one target memory in that list, which is a false memory. So this is the memory: did you ever meet and shake hands with your favorite TV character at a theme resort? Okay, so people in the first week said no, had never done that. Then they returned the following week, and half of the people received what is called a Walt Disney ad, and half of the people received a control ad. So in this Disney ad, this is what it said. Again, this is a little bit like guided imagery. So Mickey asks you to remember the magic. Go back to your childhood and remember the characters of your youth: Mickey, Goofy, and Daffy Duck. Try to recall the day your parents finally brought you to their home at Walt Disney World Resort. Imagine how you felt when you first saw Mickey with your own eyes up close. Your mother pushing you in his direction so you would shake his hand, wanting to capture the moment in a picture. You needed no urging, but somehow the closer you got, the bigger he got. He doesn't look that big on TV, you thought. And a moment before reaching him, you stop in your tracks. It hits you, and it hits you hard. Mickey, the character you've idolized on TV, is only several feet away. Your heart stops, but that doesn't stop your hands from sweating. You wipe them off just before reaching to grab his hand. The excitement rushes through you. You don't know whether you'll faint or explode. And then the moment is over. The only remnants of your flushed face and soon to be developed pictures. And then it goes on. Moments such as these are lived every day at Walt Disney World Resort. Now, I just want to tell you that the people who came to this second session thought they were doing some consumer research, and they were asked to evaluate how good the ads were and whether they would convince people to go to Disney World. So, but half of the people received control ads and half of the people received these Disney ads. After they read the ads, they were given 5 minutes to write down how the ad made them feel and what it made them think about. And then they rated the ad on a variety of dimensions. What happened then was, a couple of weeks later, they came back and they were asked whether or not they had ever gone to Disneyland and met a character and shook hands with a character that they admired. So here are the results of that study. So let me just orient you here. This is the believability that it actually happened. So that means that it went down from the first time to the last interview, stayed the same from the first time to the last interview, or the believability went up from the first to the last interview. As you can see, the only people who believed it less or the same as the first time when they were asked are the people in the control group. And in fact, the people in the Disney ad, look at the believe, I don't know why I have 120 here. It should go only to 100, but the vast majority of them found it as much more believable. I just want to point out that also even a chunk of the control group also started to think that the story was believable because, again, you're being interviewed multiple times. And that's something that we've seen with suggestibility as well, is if you're interviewed multiple times, you start to believe that something in fact is true. Well, Loftus did this very same study again with another set of characters. She did the same exact thing, but this time she asked people about Ariel. So they had gone to Disneyland and shook hands with Ariel, or that they had gone to Disney and shook hands with Bugs Bunny. Now, the reason she did this was because a lot of people felt that the Disney ad the one where you shook hands with Mickey, the reason why so many people may have bought it is because it is a plausible thing. You do see those kinds of commercials on TV where there was a Disneyland and children shaking hands with characters and things like that. So this time she used Ariel and Bugs. Well, what's the problem with Ariel and Bugs? Well, at the time that she ran the study, there was no Ariel down in Disneyland, because when those adults were children, um, Ariel was not a Disney character. And of course, Bugs Bunny, you'll never see down in Disneyland. Why is that? Because Bugs is a Warner Bros. Cartoon. So she did the study again with Ariel and Bugs just to see whether in fact it was true. And this found exactly the same thing, okay? So that what you saw was that the feelings that you had met them, it was up by the last interview, when even when we asked you about Ariel and Bugs, who you could not have seen at Disneyland. So it was based on those studies that Elizabeth Loftus published this book in 1994, and it was at the height of the repressed memory movement. She's published some of her research, talked about whether or not these allegations were true, and she got a lot of hostile kinds of feedback from this book. It was accepted by the researchers, but the therapists hate it. She was getting hate mail. She was getting death threats. Somebody sent her a voodoo doll with pins in it. One commenter sent a message to her saying, "We're going to kill you, bitch." So, I mean, it was very, very violent. And it was because people had a lot of emotions wrapped up in this repressed memory movement. Turning away a little bit from Elizabeth Loftus now, I mentioned that hypnosis is also something that was used a lot in the repressed memory movement. And this is one study that was done by Nicholas Spanos, and it was pretty clever. So what he did was he had participants come in, and he led them to believe that they had really well coordinated eye movements and visual exploration skills. So they gave a bogus test, and they said, "Wow, you know, your visual exploration skills are amazing. You know what? We think it was probably due to being born. When you were born, the hospital that you were born into probably had a mobile over your crib. So that started your visual exploration really very young." So they're suggesting that there's a mobile over your crib. Then what they did was they said, "Listen, can we hypnotize you and age regress you and see whether in fact there is a mobile over your crib?" Another half of the group, they did guided mnemonic restructuring, which is guided imagery, basically. Okay, and so what they did was they used these techniques to try to see whether there was a mobile, and you can guess the results, can't you? The majority of the people were susceptible to the misleading information. 95% of the guided and 70% of the hypnotized participants reported the mobile. So you have them in this guided imagery. You're taking them back, taking them back. Now you're in your crib. Can you see it? Yes, I can see it. What does it look like? Oh, it has little shapes on it. And 70% and 95% of the people could report that mobile. 56% of the guided and 46% of the hypnotized could report the color of it. Imagine that. And then when questioned later, 49% of these people claimed these were real memories. This is not a fake memory. When in fact we know that can't be true. Because of infantile amnesia, there's no way you could have a memory for what was in your crib right after you were born. So again, this particular study then showed that there was a problem with some of the techniques that were being used by the therapists. So by the mid-90s, researchers had found multiple problems with the kinds of therapy that people were doing. Most of the memories were recovered after extended questioning, mainly in therapy. And the researchers showed that they could mimic many of these techniques in the laboratory and create false memories. And they were using techniques in the laboratory that paled in comparison to what was being done in therapy. So what we had then was um, a, a bunch of research that was being published that called into question what was going on in the United States. And the court started to notice. In 1995, for example, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that repressed memory was not admissible as evidence because of its unreliability. But a year later, the U.S. District Court allowed repressed memory into evidence in court cases. So what happened at about 95, 96, the tide started turning in these cases. And you can see that halfway through the decade, the courts were not in agreement as to whether or not repressed memories should be allowed in the courtrooms. But pretty soon after that, there was a tsunami of change. So you can see here, and by the way, I don't care if I don't want you to know anything about these particular cases, but I just want you to notice the dates here. These are all cases in which the court ruled against allowing repressed memory into trial. And what you can see here is you've got 95, 96, 95, 96, 95, 96, 96, 96, 96, 96, 96. That was at about the time that there was a turn in the tide. Also, you started to see lawsuits from former patients. Some patients who had a recovered memory took their parents to court, sued them, or tried to bring charges against them. Later on, started thinking that those memories weren't real. Or you could have family members who had been sent to jail who had lawsuits against the families. So what you had now in this time, look, you're talking about 95, 96, 97, you have patients and family members suing the therapists. So what in Minnesota, $2.6 million in damages awarded to the family. In Minnesota, $2.5 million against the therapists. In 97, $2.4 million out of court settlement in Wisconsin. In Texas, $5.8 million. Okay. Chicago, $10.6 million. And then in Wisconsin in 99, $850,000 awarded to the families or patients who had undergone repressed and recovered memory. What happened then, given these lawsuits, insurance companies became alarmed at the massive payments that were being granted in these cases, and companies started to limit coverage when therapists use these kind of suggestive, untested therapies with their clients. And so what we had then was a backlash against them. Today, I would say that in many jurisdictions, repressed memories are not going to be allowed in the court. However, it's not true universally, and it would be in a court-by-court basis as to whether or not a repressed memory would be allowed. In other words, there has not been any Supreme Court ruling on them, and very few appeals court rulings that block them from certain jurisdictions. So before I end, I want to take a slightly different turn and tell you about some research that my students did looking at repressed memories. And it was about this time when everything was going on. With Matt Dameyer, who is a PhD student, he was really interested. He's a clinical student. He was a clinical student. He's a clinical psychologist now. He was really interested in what types of therapists were believed in repressed memory. So he did a survey of experimental psychologists who were researchers, clinical psychologists, and social workers. And he asked them about controversial topics. For example, whether or not they believed in repressed memory. And then he asked them about their training and practice information in terms of, what kind of training you do, what kind of practices you have, what kind of clients do you have, so forth. And I just want to share with you some of his results. Here's with degree. This is the important question. Do you believe in repressed and recovered memories? And what you can see here is you see the experimental folks are much more skeptical than either the clinical. Oh, by the way, the PsyD is a professional degree where you don't really get any training in research. And you can see the PsyDs were the ones that really were most likely to endorse this, but certainly the MSWs also as well. Um, Again, this is another one having to do with repressed memory. That was another way of asking the question. Again, you see the experimental psychologist much more um, skeptical. And this is whether or not therapy could bring out false memories of abuse. You can see here that the experimental psychologists were much more likely to say, in fact, yes, therapy can do that. And you can see that some of these others were not. And this was another one, can leading questions lead children to report false information? And again, you saw that degree predicted whether or not you believe some of these things. The next thing that Matt asked is looking at clinicians only, so people who had clinical, uh, worked with clients, and whether or not they were involved in research. And so what he did here was if whether they had published papers, had gone to a research conference. So it was simply a yes or no. If they had at least gone to one conference per year, then they were considered research active. And we broke it apart there. And as you can see here, is the people who had at least gone to a research conference, uh, that's a very minimal bar here, were much more skeptical than those who were not involved in research in any way. So, can therapy bring out false memories? Can leading questions lead children to make false claims? So, what he basically showed was that having some kind of research background made you more skeptical and made you less likely to fall for some of these claims. Now, the repressed memory movement is gone, but the point is that these things can happen again. You have something go through the country, people believe it, and then you need to look at the research. You have to actually look at data to see whether or not, in fact, we're doing something wrong. And I do believe that that was something that was happening in this country at that time. So this is a great lesson in maybe hysteria, a great lesson in how research can be used to actually answer questions and um, change change things when they're not going well. Okay? So that's it on repressed memories. Next time we're going to start looking at eyewitness memory. Thank you.